people on Zoom. If you ask a question, they cannot hear you. So I'm going to ask you, if you have a question, to go to the stand and ask the question, and that way they can hear what it is you're asking as well. Okay? That's what, right. For those of you on Zoom, what we can do is if you'll type your question into the Zoom room, Debbie will get it, and at some point we'll stop and I'll get those questions as well, okay? But otherwise it's not going to be possible if you're on Zoom to ask the questions directly because we can't hear it here either. We're trying to blend the needs and figure out new ways of doing all this. Wait another minute or two. That's exactly it. No, third got lost. He was planning on coming but got lost. All right, so I'm hoping everybody at home on Zoom, and I can't see you, so I'm going to speak in the generic. I'm hoping you were able to print off the readings. We sent them out last week, and so you can follow them as we read them here. I'm going to ask for readers if you're willing to step to the stand and read it out loud for us, and this way we have different. All right, the first three readings are anecdotal. Okay? All right, so somebody read the first one. Gail, second one. Sandy, third one. I'll read the third one because it's me. It was on a second. It is on. Oh, I turned on the wrong one. Testing. There we go. It's working now. That was.
A woman in her 50s working on her doctorate in a literary field called to make an appointment to discuss her studies. She is a serious student, a particularly organized woman who is self-described as very rational. In the course of our conversation, she said, "Rabbi, I had an experience that I want to tell you about. One night I had a very vivid dream in which my brother, who died several years before, appeared to me and said that something important was going to happen. I was so startled by the intensity of and vividness of the dream and the message that I awoke and sat on the edge of my bed. Soon the phone rang. It was my family thousands of miles away. They told me that my father had just died of a sudden heart attack. Neither I nor they had any indication that he had even been sick."
Reading two, Sandy? Sandy, Leslie? Yeah.
Another woman, a principal of a neighboring Jewish school, attended a presentation on Jewish mourning given by a nationally acclaimed author at my synagogue. I mentioned to the author over lunch that I had become aware of the importance of the supernatural in and around death, a topic he had excluded from his book. The principal overheard me and said, "I have a great story to tell you in that regard. My husband and I were beginning to drive the hour and a half from Palm Springs to our home when our otherwise healthy husband suddenly felt a severe pain over his heart. The pain was so severe that I had to take over at the wheel. When we listened to the messages on the answering machine at home, we learned that his father had had a sudden heart attack at almost the precise moment that my husband had that pain."
Okay. The third one is not something I've talked about a lot in my life, but I'll share with you. I vividly remember a winter morning during my 5th grade year in New Jersey when I was suddenly pulled from class by my parents. My mother's grandfather, in his 90s, was on his deathbed, and my tearful mother, who revered her grandfather, was adamant about taking the 3-hour drive to Albany, New York, in an attempt to see him one last time before he died. The sense of urgency in the car was palpable as we trekked north along the New York State Thruway. Suddenly pale, my mother startled us by saying, "You need to pull over at the next stop now." Finding the opportunity, my father parked at one of the rest stops, and my mother phoned her family. This was before cell phones, obviously. It was at that precise moment when she had called out in the car that her grandfather had passed away. So we have stories of some sense of an awareness of death, even in not being there, not being present. All right? And for Jews, it's an interesting thing. Rabbi Harold Schulweis writes the following. He says, "You ask me what I believe about the afterlife, and I am struck in turn by the fact that your question is rarely asked by Jews. If you do a generic, let's ask about Judaism, these are not the questions that generally come up." He says it's different when he speaks to a Christian audience. He says almost invariably the first questions they ask, what do you believe about the afterlife? He further notes, so one of the things we're going to do is look at why that might be. So the emphasis in Judaism is on the exercise of human free will to mend the universe. To fix the world in which and the universe in which we live. And he says, this is Schulweis, he feels that the ambivalence towards the afterlife lies in the fact that it may cause a lack of individual and social activism here. If you're worried about the afterlife, you stop worrying about fixing things in the world in which we live. So reading number 4, I need another reader. If nobody volunteers, I'll read. All right, bivakasha. What's that? No, we have 1 hour. I teach in here at 12:10 with the kids. We have 1 hour. I didn't. Okay, I apologize for that. It's 1 hour.
Never mind.
Yeah.
Never mind. Okay.
Reading number 4.
A story is told about a pious Jew who boasts to his rabbi that he had saved another Jew's soul. A beggar had asked him for a meal, and he agreed, but insisted that first they must daven mincha. And before serving him the meal, he ordered the beggar to wash his hands and recite the appropriate blessing, and thereafter to recite Hamotzi. The rabbi showed his annoyance with his pious disciple. "There are times, my son, when you must act as if there were no God." The disciple taken aback by this counsel protested, "How should I, a man of faith, act as if no God existed?" The rabbi replied, "When someone comes to you in need, as this beggar came, act as if there were no God in the universes, as if you alone are in the world and that there is no one to help him except you yourself." The disciple asked aloud, "And I have no responsibility for his soul." The rabbi replied, "Take care of your soul and his body, not vice versa."
I love that midrash. Love that midrash. Stop worrying about his soul. Take care of yourself. Meanwhile, take care of his physical needs and let him worry about his soul. We'll get him there. All right? We tend to extend onto others. The story expresses the apprehension that an exaggerated emphasis on spirituality as God as provider and rewarder may actually paralyze us in terms of how we get involved in doing God's work in the world. That, I think, there's an important statement. In terms of the afterlife, in early Midrash, the rabbis described it, even Moses, as is refusing to provide any details. Reading 5a, the children of Israel are gathered in front of Moses, and he is asked, "Tell us what goodness the Holy One will give us in the world to come." Moses responds, "I don't know what I can tell you." And so in this case, it's genuine ignorance. He's not sure. So even Moses doesn't have such answers. 5b, all of our prophets foretell only what will happen in the days of the Messiah. But as for Olam Haba, what happens between now and Messianic times, if you die, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, O God, besides you, taken from Isaiah. So we're going to talk about ultimate times, and we're going to talk about what happens after death in the interim. All right? They're two separate concepts. First thing to note is for Judaism, there's a recognition that everyone's going to die. We read what man can live and not see death in Psalms. In Pirkei Avot, it says, those who are born are destined to die. You were created against your will. You had no input. Despite your wishes, you live, and against your will, you will die. Not yours to say. You didn't have decision anywhere along the process. It's just inevitable. Everyone at the same time is curious. You're all sitting here because you want to know the nature of the afterlife and if it really exists. We all have that curiosity, particularly as we're no longer in our 20s. It becomes more and more relevant as you get older. All right? If people could be sure that there is life after death, many people might behave differently. Right? The entire question of morality, of reward and punishment, and why bad things happen to good people is tied to the question of what is the afterlife. If nothing exists beyond, why not party? Okay, that would be a Jewish question. So the very purpose of our existence is tied to the question in many ways of the afterlife. Some Jewish thinkers, Freud and many others, have suggested that the idea of the hereafter is psychologically motivated. It's a projection of a human need. It's not real. Achad Ha'am, in the beginning of the 1900s, maintained that the desire for existence forces people to seek consolation not only against the sufferings of the life that is theirs today, but against also the bitterness of the death that tomorrow will bring. Not finding what they want in the world, this is Achad Ha'am, they arrive finally at the idea of a world beyond nature and transfer the center of the gravity of that of their ego from the body to the soul. Now the soul is not a biblical concept. We'll talk about that in a second. So reading number 6, and I'm going to continue reading because I'm getting the sense there's no strong desire to do so. So reading number 6. Even as a child, I believed that when I died, the whole world of my existence would disappear with me. My world would last only as long as I did. I was convinced that I had arisen out of nothing and was destined to return to nothing. All human beings were locked in the same fatality. In the final analysis, omnipotent nothingness was Lord of all creation. Nothing in the bleak, cold, unfeeling universe was remotely concerned with human aspirations and longing. Even as a rabbi, I have never really departed from my earliest primordial feeling about my place in the cosmos, and that's Joshua Cohen. I have a dear friend who's an atheist. He's a devout atheist, all right? And I've had this conversation with him about, what is this? What do you mean there's nothing? How can you conceive of nothing? And his answer to me is, have you ever had anesthesia? Yeah. What time passes? None. My brother describes having gone into a surgery telling a story and walking up from the surgery continuing the story. As if there was no time in between. So from his perspective, of course you can understand nothingness. You've already experienced it. I don't buy it. I respect he's my good friend. I'm going to jump off number 7 and jump over it. Like most religions today, Judaism in large majority, emphatically does believe in an afterlife, but the character of that is very different and specific to Judaism. I'm going to give you very broad strokes. This is the big picture from which we'll build. Number 1, according to Jewish tradition, the dead will be resurrected and come before God to account for their lives on earth. We sing that every week. Mechalkel chayim b'chesed, mechaye metim, who gives life to the dead, berachamim rabim, with great mercy. We sing it. So that's the first. The dead will be resurrected. 2, that the righteous will be rewarded and the evil punished. There's some recompense at the end. 3, that Jews, free of the yoke of exile, will return to the homeland, rebuild it, and become masters of their own destiny. That's Israel. Whether or not it's Israel in its final form, we still have responsibilities to get it there. 4, that we will rebuild the temple and reinstitute the temple cult. Now I'm going to tell you conservative Judaism has basically thrown that one out. We believe in messianic times, but that doesn't necessarily mean a return to killing animals. All right? We would say we've evolved beyond that. that the nations of the world will flock to study Torah with the Jewish people, that peace and justice will rule, that the tensions that now pervade our world will disappear. As Isaiah says, the wolf shall lie with the lamb. My rabbi in Dallas used to say, I know how to make peace between a lamb and a wolf. Get a new lamb every day. That all people will come to know and worship the God of Israel. And finally, this will all be brought together by a charismatic figure known as Mashiach, the Messiah, the anointed one. Right? By the way, there's no divinity to that character at all. David is called the Mashiach, David the king. We refer to him, David ben Yishai Avdecha Meshichecha. We sing that on Saturday mornings. David ben Yishai Avdecha Meshichecha. All right, that David is called the Messiah. We have Balaam. Not Balaam, there's a non-Jewish character who is also referred to as the anointed one. It's not any king. When they were put into place, they placed oil on their head and they became the Messiah, not Mashiach in the sense of a Messiah, but that's what it really means, the anointed one. Messiah means anointed. All of this took centuries, almost a millennia, to develop. The more universal themes, like the idea of no more warfare, are clear through Isaiah. That at some point, that's all going to happen. On the other hand, the idea that human beings will live again after death cannot be found in Jewish writings. It's much before the 2nd century of the Common Era. All right, that's when it entered. You cannot find anything about a soul when you die until really the 1st century before the Common Era. When you use the word nephesh in Hebrew in the Bible, it just means a soul. 70 souls. 70 souls descended into Egypt. They weren't dead. It's a person. All right? 70 souls. That's the word they use for those who went down to Egypt, the nephesh. All right? There is no concept of a separation between body and soul. Early times. So let's look at the Bible. I'm telling you, that's not happy. We learn that the Bible has a hesitancy in describing and elaborating on the afterlife, particularly as it stands in relative nature to the other mythologies of the time. Nonetheless, what we do see is not only does the ancient Israel's borrowed concept of the afterlife from the cultures from which within they lived. All right, they emerged, and sometimes what they did, sometimes they borrowed it, and sometimes they built a belief in contrast to. So the Israelites come out of Egypt, a culture that is obsessed with the afterlife, and the Bible goes out of its way to make a distinction between what the Egyptians were doing and what we're going to do. It's in contrast to. So reading number 8 is from Joseph Telushkin. All right, if you look at reading 8, the Egyptian experience had taught the children of Israel how dangerous an obsession with the afterlife could become. Consider the major achievements of many pharaohs was to have built an enormous tomb, a pyramid for themselves. For this purpose, thousands of slaves were worked to death. The Egyptians' holiest work, the Book of the Dead, reflects that obsession with an afterlife. Perhaps the Bible did not raise the issue of an afterlife because it recognized that when it became central to religion, it diverts people's attention from their responsibilities in this world. So you're hearing an echo. This is Joseph Telushkin. He's a pretty strong traditionalist. So it's not, we rejected that which the what the Egyptians were doing, but the Babylonians, when we were exiled to Babylonia, the Babylonian notion of a dreary realm of existence seems much more consistent with the biblical understanding of Sheol. That's the term you're going to see throughout the Bible. It is a land of deepest gloom where Job anticipates going after his death. It appears throughout the text. It is the netherworld. It is the bowels of the earth. It is the pit. It's that in Job, he describes it as the limit of human awareness. It's a metaphor for God's ultimate mystery. Okay? Job, you look at 9, this is from Job. Would you discover the mystery of God? Would you discover the limits of the Almighty? Higher than heaven, what can you do? Deeper than Sheol, what can you know? Let me give you some descriptions from the Bible of what Sheol, this is where, okay, this is the afterlife according to the Bible. Its gates and its bars make escape impossible. That's Isaiah 38. It is a monster with gaping jaws that aggressively devour all men and is never sated. Isaiah 5. It is a place of maggots and decay. Job 13. Anybody want to buy into this? We're not happy with the biblical perspective here. It is clear from these biblical passages that Sheol was believed to be a place under the ground. 13 times it's mentioned in the Bible. It uses the word yarad, yud, resh, daled, which is to go down. So clearly that was somehow the concept. Graphically, the book of Numbers recalls the fate of the rebellious Korach and his camp, and it says, whom opening its mouth the earth swallowed, and they and all their possessions went down to Sheol. It's clear we have a repeated pattern. We have Isaiah, we have it in Job, we have it in Numbers. There's a repeated pattern. To claim that one goes down to Sheol is to go into the bowels of the earth beyond the awareness, human awareness. In that model, what is described is they lose any possible relationship with God. You lose all possible relationship with other inhabitants of Sheol. You lose all possible connection with the living and with anything that transpires on earth. You're gone. You don't even have access to God. When Jacob dies, we're told that he will never know Benjamin again, for there's no relationship between the inhabitants of Sheol. More equally important, Sheol does not discriminate between righteous and evil people. All human beings go to Sheol. That includes Jacob. We're told plain and simply that's where he's going. So the certainty certainly does not represent any judgment on the people themselves. Why? Why is the Bible trying to, why is the Bible's message that there's nothing more? And there's at least two reasons why. The first, as I described before, is an avoidance of the idolatrous practices of the people around them, like in Egypt, where they worshiped death. The second is to make a clear demarcation between that which is God and that which is human. As the ancient world understood, 1,000 years was the equivalent to eternity. It is not an accident that Methuselah is the longest person in the Bible. He lives to 990. He doesn't make it to 1,000. That's not an accident. It's a message of man is limited and God is not. Are we all happy? Yeah, I told you we're going to like what the Bible has to say, and I'll come back to it in a few minutes. Let me give you a sense of the life of the ancient Israelites. It's very different from ours. Think Mayberry RFD, okay? The world would have been small little towns and villages where everybody knew everybody, and people didn't move. There were ties of birth and marriage and kinship. No one was left out. You knew everybody. The next generation was going to stay there. Everybody stayed there. The people surrounding them felt strong responsibility one for the other, and they would have experienced this great solidarity and cohesion with all the troubles that reflects as well, by the way, like rivalries and jealousies and all that kind of stuff. Cohesion sounds nice in theory. It also has problems come with it. As developed as one may have been individually, the family, the clan, and the tribe and peoplehood were extensions of oneself. An individual had no identity outside of its community. All right? I often will say the smallest unit in Jewish tradition is the community, not the individual. Jews don't have individual rights, they have individual responsibilities to the community and to God. It's in this world that Deuteronomy then describes punishment for sin. If you look at V'haya im shamoa, the second paragraph of the Shema, it's not, if you sin, I'm going to get you. That's not what God is saying. He's saying, if y'all sin, I'm going to get y'all. I'm going to stop rain from the heavens. You won't have food. You're going to die. The punishment is in the collective because there is no, the individual is, that's, the sense of that individual need is an American concept. It is not a Jewish concept. Every life matters, for sure. But in a sense, its value is ultimately within the community. People in those worlds, if you built a house, your kids were going to live in it, your next kids were going to live in it. How many of you have that? So when you build a house, suddenly the house doesn't have that permanent sense. We're going to sell our house, and then your kids have their own homes. It doesn't have the same value. The same thing with plowing your fields or anything else. Once you expand from that, I know everybody, and everybody's going to say here, everything changes in process. By the way, just as an aside, the centrality of the Bible, of the motif of childlessness and childbearing is also playing here. Being childless is not just a matter of a thwarted parent instinct or an empty house. It's the breaking of that chain. Of course, you have the same house, you have the same yards, you have the same everything. It's a breaking in the chain. It's a rupture. So if you become childless, that's why it was so concerned with the Bible is so concerned with inheritance rights. So first, I'm going to back to the topic at hand. The destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians in 586. You have a mass exile. You have a loss of national independence, and that's the rupture of which I'm speaking. History now seems less smooth, and there's more discontinuity. Jews in Babylonia differed from Israelites who had lived in Israel. We were more varied, we were more dispersed, we're more organized. We didn't only live in the land of Israel, we're all over the world, and they lived in Babylonia, in Egypt, in North Africa, along the Mediterranean coast. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were living in Alexandria, tens of thousands in Rome, 120,000 were still in Jerusalem. Few of them spoke any Hebrew. Their main language was Aramaic and Greek. Different schools and interpretations of Judaism developed. They developed some because of their influence of the cultures in which they're now living. That's the key. Dispersion exposes us to different thinkings. Many Jews drifted away from Judaism altogether. At the same time, we had Gentiles joining us. You'll have the Erev Rav, the multitudes who joined the people as well. But what you lost in this process is that homogeneous, cohesive Israelite society that had existed before. And so the argument in that world of living on through your descendants doesn't seem as powerful. Who knew where the descendants were going to be? Children and grandchildren, in our world, they grow up, they move away, and you make your annual visit to Baltimore, right? You didn't travel in the ancient world. It was dangerous. Abraham moves away. His family is not seeing it. They're not going for family visits. You're now creating your own world. One could no longer assume that neighbors knew and cared about you or even shared anything in common. You couldn't, the field cleared might be owned by somebody else. And so what you have at this point is a crisis of religious thought. And with this enter two doctrines that enter into Jewish writings that overturn the biblical thinking about death. And the main influence, as you'll see, comes from Persia. So the Jews are conquered by the Babylonians, and many of them dispersed to Babylonia. The Babylonians are 100 years later conquered by the Persians. 200 years later, they are conquered by the Greeks, and then ultimately by the Romans. So that's the sequence. So we're being exposed to multiple cultures, even though they're still living in Babylonia. Okay? They're being ruled by different people, therefore different cultures. The first idea that emerges in this, and again, about the 2nd century before the Common Era, is Techiyat Hametim, the resurrection, that there's a possibility of resurrection from death. Similar phrases are used in the Akkadian prayers of a deity, where reviving the dead had a specific meaning to them. It meant restoring the gravely ill to good health, which was the original understanding of this phrase. And you may or may not know, I was sitting at a Shabbos dinner, probably about 15, right after I got here, within the first year. I was at Rhoda Goldberg's house for a Shabbos dinner, and my phone rang. And it was my brother on the phone saying they had just discovered, Mom had had several cancers. She'd taken to the hospital. They had discovered a huge cancer, and she had 2 weeks to live. Needless to say, I went running out of Shabbos dinner, okay? Turns out that the doctor in the hospital misread what was scar tissue from a previous cancer surgery, and she ended up living another 4 or 5 years, all right? From that point on, I referred to Mom as Techiyat Hametim. All right, she was the resurrection of the dead. She was healed. In the Akkadian and in the early Hebrew sense of the word, she had become Techiyat Hametim. Eventually, however, the Talmud speaks of resurrection metaphorically also, mandating the reciting of a blessing coming from the Talmud. If you haven't seen somebody in a year, there's a blessing of Techiyat Hametim. It's as if in my world you've been dead. I'm glad to have you back. In the COVID world, it means a lot. This blessing should be used a lot. All right? But eventually, the bracha was expanded to incorporate a belief in a resurrection of the dead, and giving life to the dead is now entered into the concepts. Now, I want to take one controversial text in the Bible that would claim otherwise, but I'll show you why it's not. There's this text that is typically cited as supporting a claim that the idea of resurrection existed much earlier. And that is the text of Ezekiel 37, the prophet's vision of the dry bones that are then clothed with flesh, infused with breath, and brought back to life. That's what the Bible tells us. But the key to understanding that passage lies in God's own interpretation of what it means. If you look at reading 11, this is from Ezekiel 37. O mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are doomed. Prophesy, therefore, and say to them, thus says the Lord God, I am going to open your graves and lift you out of the graves of my people and bring you to the land of Israel. It is metaphorical. It's saying it's as if the people have died. The people of Israel have died, and God is going to return them to the land. It's messianic. It isn't meant to be taken literal. God himself is telling you, don't be an idiot. Don't take this literally. So that's concept one, the resurrection. But what about between death and ultimate resurrection? What's going on? So the second idea that enters into Jewish thought, this is in the 1st century of the Common Era, you see it in Pharisaic thought, is that the human body may be mortal, but now they introduce the concept of a soul. There's a distinction between body and soul. The soul separates from body at death and enjoys a continued existence with God. That is right out of Persian thought, where the Jews had lived in the 300s and 400s before the Common Era. Right out of it. It's the position of the Pharisees. As I said to you, the Bible made no distinction. Nephesh, which we translate as soul, meant people in the Bible. However, the rabbis go looking for a way to understand, how can I find it back in the Bible? And here's what they do. They say Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Aaron, Moses die. The Torah in each case explains, it says that each of them expired and was gathered to his people. Right? Rabbis are looking for a way. And so what they do is they separate those two out. And they'll say to you, he expired, means he's dead. Gathered to his people is something completely different. It doesn't refer to that, because it already said he's dead. It refers to something where the soul goes on and gathered back to the people. So they're playing on the fact that biblical poetry is often the expression of the same thing in dyads, two different times in different words. So it's a basic form of biblical writing. But the rabbi's looking to understand, how can I put the soul back into the earlier writings, found a way to distinguish, and therefore they superimpose or retrospectively superimpose meaning on what it would be that there would be a soul. So let's talk about the soul. We all like soul food and soul music. What's a soul? In modern parlance, it's the inner component that survives beyond the physical plane. Within Jewish tradition, there are a variety of understandings of the common starting point that the soul is no less than an extension of God. The rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud elaborated on this link in reading number 12. They didn't call it reading number 12, but it's in reading number 12. This is from the Talmud, Brachot 10a. As God fills the whole world, so also the soul fills the whole body. As God sees but cannot be seen, so also the soul sees but cannot be seen. As God nourishes the whole world, so also the soul nourishes the whole body. As God is pure, so also the soul is pure. As God dwells in the innermost part of the universe, so also the soul dwells in the innermost part of the body. There's direct connections here, and direct parallels. So where, as I said to you, where does this all come from? Where do these ideas of resurrection and a soul that lives beyond come from? It is likely, as I said, from Persian times. It's in the centuries after Cyrus conquered the Babylonians, and under Persian rule, our ancestors are exposed to Zoroastrian beliefs. They have a belief in the text of the afterlife in which judgment would be rendered of the individual. So it's not just that you exist, but there's judgment that comes with it. And in subsequent times, when they are then conquered by the Syrian Greeks, political events lead to the full adoption of these ideas. And I'm going to tell you specifically. You may have heard of Antiochus of the Hanukkah story. The assault of Antiochus was devastating for the Jewish people. But it also, the suffering, it did not seem to have any distinction between the righteous and the evil. Everyone was killed. All those, there's no distinction being made. And suddenly, you've got a problem. Where is divine justice? It's the first time that that question really is arising. Where is divine justice when everybody's meeting the same fate? In a world that has no afterlife, how do you make sense of that? All right? And so, if in this ideological vacuum enters the assertion that death would not be final, and that reward and punishment would ultimately be meted out in the afterworld. They borrowed from the Zoroastrians at a time in which they could not make sense of a world in which the suffering under Antiochus didn't seem to make sense. So into this structure, we have a belief in divine justice that would be restored by creating an afterlife in which it could be those who suffer inappropriately will be rewarded in the afterlife. Those who seem to prosper and evil that prosper will be punished in the afterlife. One step further, Isaiah states that God will destroy death forever. All right, this is Neil Gaiman's book, if you haven't seen it, The Death of Death. All right. If it's taken literally, the claim would be a stunning anticipation of a final stage of resurrection. God will not only resurrect the dead, but will kill death in process. So what does that mean? Some scholars suggest that what will be destroyed is not necessarily death itself, but the kind of mass dying caused by warfare. Well, that's Isaiah. There'll no longer be death by warfare. If so, you have Isaiah's words playing out real strongly. You have beat their swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, and never again no war. Fits nicely. There's another possible interpretation. It is suggested that this is a relic of a pagan god of the underworld whose name was Mavet. What is the name? What's Mavet mean in Hebrew? Death. There was a pagan god by the name of Mavet who triumphed in his battle against Baal, the god of fertility, and then is later killed by Baal's sister. You have the battles of the gods. True paganism at its best. All right? By the time, however, we read in the Mishnah, which is then written around 200 of the Common Era, we read, all Israelites have a share in the age to come, as it is said, your people shall be righteous, they shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, that I may be glorified. Somehow, we've gone from no afterlife to the beginning of the Mishnah, and of course there's an afterlife. Why are you even asking the question? These are the ones that the Mishnah goes on to say, who have no portion in the world to come. The one who says there is no resurrection of the dead, and that Torah doesn't come from heaven. So if you're a conservative Jew, we got surahs, according to Mishnah Sanhedrin, that you don't believe the Torah is from God, and or you don't believe in an afterlife. That's a jump from biblical thought. That's a huge jump. And just to take this step of the death of death a little further, anybody ever sing Chad Gadya on Passover? Chad Gadya, right? Chad Gadya chronicles the fate of a kid who's eaten by a cat, who's eaten by a dog, on and on and on. And finally, the angel of death slaughters the slaughterer. And then in the last verse, then came the Holy One, blessed be he, and slaughtered the angel of death. Death itself will cease to exist. That became very clear. Now, how many of you like the idea of Mechayim Mitim, resurrection of the dead? How many of us are comfortable with resurrection of the dead? I would bet if I went around the room that at best there'd be hesitancy. Okay? At best. Neil Gilman says, wait a minute, let me point something out here. And he says the following, reading number 13. This is out of his book here. If, in fact, God created the world and humanity in the first place, if God is the ultimate force, whose power extends over all of nature and history, if God can send Israel into exile and then redeem it again, if God can renew the natural cycles each year, if God can, as Isaiah 66 promises, create a new heaven and earth, then why can't God raise human beings from the grave? Why can't God, in the words of Isaiah 25:8, destroy death forever? Why should God's power over one's fate end with death? Why is death more powerful than God? It's a great question. All right, if you want to accept this concept of Mechayim, that's a great question. Why do you think death has greater power than God does? And suddenly it doesn't seem as bizarre. All right, I finish up here a little bit. One more idea. Whereas in modern times, we often find ourselves removed from the moment of death. Most of us do not encounter death directly. We go to hospitals. Most of us do not on a regular basis, it's not in the house, and the family's gathered around the bed of the person in the house, and you have the children around, etc., and they're exposed to all this. We've moved into this sort of sterile world where we have to protect one another from this moment. This is my own lecture here. Now I'm stepping out of my notes. It's a terrible thing. First, it's a terrible thing for a number of reasons. Number one, dying is a process of life. It's another experience, just like anything else. People who are dying feel cut off because nobody will talk to them about the fact that they're dying because they feel uncomfortable and they don't want to upset the dying person. And the dying person doesn't want to say anything because he doesn't want to upset the people around him. And it's the one major experience in life which we don't talk. We don't share our feelings in that moment. We tell you, I love you, but we don't talk about the moment. And I think that's tragic. I think kids should be exposed to death. Right? I think 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds will understand it differently than a 10-year-old who will understand it differently than a 15-year-old, but they need to be exposed. It's part of life, and it's unfair for Zadie not to have time with the kid. or at the moment of death, or even after the funeral. The kid, I was 8 years old. I went to my great-grandfather's funeral. All right, my parents had a strong belief. This is part of life, and you need to expose people to it and understand it. It's not fair to do otherwise. It cheats the dying person, and it cheats the family. So one of the problems, I'm switching back, with that is we now have different understandings scientifically of when the moment of death occurs. In the ancient world, you put a feather up to somebody's nose. How many of you want to be declared dead if they put a feather by your nose and it doesn't move? Not me. Don't put me in the ground if that's your test. Okay? I want something more sophisticated. All right? God knows 1,000 years from now, they'll look at the way we determine death now and say, what ancient people? How could they have actually believed that was dead? Who knows? But I certainly don't want a feather to my nose as the determining factor. Somebody make sure I'm dead, please, okay? But the reality is, discerning death in the ancient world was far more difficult. And so what they did, they buried people in caves. It wasn't in the ground. It was that came about much later. And they would visit the body for 3 days after the death. Why? 3 days later, you could tell by the smell, was the person still alive or dead? You could verify, which I found. And you'll find when you visit, you'll often find these bottles and remnants of oils. What were the oils for? It smelled! That was your sign the person was dead. So they tried to overcome that which was negative. So that's where I'm going to stop for today. That's the biblical understanding of things. And then as it starts to shift, I'm going to take it much further into rabbinic thought in 2 weeks, but I'm open to questions. So let's start. Anybody here has a question? We'll start here. And then Debbie, were there any online? Okay. No questions? Go ahead, Sandy.
When the rabbis during the 1st and 2nd century started interpreting words in the Bible to coincide with these Persian or other cultures' concepts, was it their way of comforting the people?
Of what? Comforting?
Of giving comfort to people who were then upset and said, well, these guys over here have a concept, why don't we? I have to imagine, and again, let me just say the following, and then I'll answer the question directly. I am not a spiritual Jew. I'm a rational Jew. There are different ways of approaching text. I personally have no use for Kabbalah, none, zero, all right? I am a rationalist. I fit into the category of the mitnagdim, of the kollels that you might find in Lakewood. I don't fit into the Hasidic world. Both are equally orthodox, and for years they couldn't even talk to each other. All right? Nonetheless, I'm a neged, not a Hasid. All right? I believe that yes, many of our customs came about because we live in real worlds. A real world that God created. God created the non-Jews too. All right? And so we're exposed to alternative ways that God has somehow enabled in the universe to exist. And there are moments in which we borrow. There are ways they borrow from us too. It's not a one-way street. There's interactions that happen. And I'm going to use an example of those kinds of borrowings. Many of you may have heard me say this before, and I apologize if you have. And that is the Hanukkah lights and the Christmas lights. It's not an accident that both of us use lights at the same time of year. It's not an accident. In the pagan world, they believed that as the days got shorter, that the sun was becoming weaker. This is their understanding of the universe. Obviously, it's not very scientific, but it is their understanding of how the universe worked. And what they figured out is that on the day of the winter solstice, if everybody would get together and light flames, you could re-empower the sun, and the days would get longer. Lo and behold, it happened. Now, the causality is a little questionable. I admit that. But if you're just going by correlation, it works. All right?
Obviously, I'm not buying. But at the same time, it was the time of year in which everybody was lighting lights. And what all religions do is take practices that exist in advance and superimpose new meaning to make them significant moments and holy moments. There's nothing wrong with that. We do that. We need rituals. We need rituals in our lives. We create them when we don't have them. Seventh inning stretches at a ball game, birthday parties. I've used this many times. If you haven't heard, I welcome you to the world of the sick mind of Cantor Levine. You have a birthday. You're in your home, and there's a whole group of people, or you're in somebody else's home, and they're in the kitchen, and you have to pretend you don't know that they've got a cake. Right? You pretend. You know there's a cake. You know there's a cake coming, but you have to pretend you don't know there's a cake. They bring out the cake on which they've placed a bunch of wax things with flames burning on top. They sing you a song that you wouldn't be caught dead listening to in any other situation in life. It's horrible. All right, talk about worst lyricist ever, okay? And then you take and you proceed to spread your germs all over the cake by spitting on it and blowing out the candles, and everybody says, happy birthday, and you all eat the cake that everybody spit on. All right? Conceptually, this is bizarre. Yet if they don't do it for you, you're insulted. They don't do it, yeah.
In our family, it's called, you're needed in the kitchen.
Right. Wink, wink. Right. The reality is, if you analyze it in its real elements, it's ridiculous. If you look at the meaning superimposed on it, it's powerful. And so the lighting of lights at winter solstice, if we just look at the pagan sources of it, it's ridiculous. If you begin to understand it through the lens of understanding its significance, then it's powerful. The same action. All right, so rituals are really important. And so it doesn't bother me that we've borrowed from others, because it's how we understand it today that matters, not what its origin was. It's a way of connecting with God for us today. Yes? Of course. So the question is, how do the rabbis understand the Saul and Samuel story and the witches of Endor? I'm not going to stand here and give you an absolute. I can tell you that it is a very, if you can find an exception, is one possibility. That might be the one exception in the Bible. I'm going to suggest to you, come in 2 weeks, and I'm going to give you an answer to that within the context of rabbinic thought. So hold the question. Okay? Yeah, because I actually will address that. I had to stop and think for a second. But one of the things is, sometimes the exception proves the rule too. Anything else online? Yes, Eric. Just say, yeah.
One thing that you said earlier that kind of struck me when you talked about, well, if the evil and the good were all, had the same experience in the afterlife, why don't we just all go,
Go party.
But when you were talking about Sheol, that in a sense, what was happening. But you also discussed the fact that the indivisible unit in ancient Israel was the community and not the individual.
Right.
Are you suggesting that the notion that the individuals, that their self-conception of what they were as individuals, their whole was very different than what it was today?
Yes, absolutely. Our concept of an individual living in America is extremely different from the ancient world. It reflects the Protestant belief of rugged individualism, all right, of survival of the fittest, right? Absolutely. It is not the way in which the ancients understood life.
I mean, we're talking actually of like a very different self-consciousness of what.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, in the same way, just think of the following. Think Tevye. Do you love me? I've been married for 25 years. What's love got to do with it? Right? It's a very different concept. That's not something we would understand today. If love has nothing to do with it, why would you get a divorce ever? You're not supposed to be in love. What's your point? Right? So yeah, I do think that the modern, it's not just America, but it's modern, post-Enlightenment thought that has developed to where it is today. It's been a process, but where we are today is very different from the ancient world, for sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Seeing no other questions, I'm going to call this court to session. We're done. Thank you all. Happy Chag Sameach, happy Pesach, Chad Gadya, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.